Okay, so now that you know what crime is and what crime isn't, now we can start talking about how do we measure crime, right? So you got an idea of what the criminal law looks like conceptually and then in modern practice. Now the question is, how do we measure when somebody breaks the law? So again, this is just a review of the modern criminal law. I won't go through it, but remember we do have the kind of modern distinction between felonies and misdemeanors, something that you're going to need to know for this lecture. All right? Felony is a year or more in prison. Misdemeanor, less than a year in jail. Right? So there's a difference between going up on the hill and going to the county jail. If we looked at the elements of various crimes, we looked at homicide, murder, first-degree murder, felony murder, second-degree manslaughter, voluntary, involuntary, and misdemeanor manslaughter. So we looked at there's all kinds of variations, right, of murder. So when we say murder, it's important for us to conceptualize and operationalize what exactly we mean, right? Because there's 6 different kinds of homicide that I have on your screen. So it's conceptually important to understand what they are. Now the problem that we're going to see is different agencies and different people define things differently. So it makes it hard to compare apples to apples. A lot of times we're comparing apples to grapefruits, not even oranges, just grapefruits. An orange would be ideal, but we're not even close. And we're going to see that. So let's begin by talking some statistics, which I know you all love to do, and heaven knows I love to do it. And if you decide to become criminal justice majors, which I encourage you all to do, you will take statistics. It is what it is. Like, you'll grin and bear it, it'll be fine. That being said, if we look at the data, right, we see a huge difference in a person's perception of crime, people's perception of crime, and actual crime rates. Right, so we kind of talked about this in our intro class, intro to intro, I should say. But if we look over here, we're talking public perception of crime. This is the percent of people that say there's more crime in the United States than there was a year ago, right? And this goes through 2014. Trends now tick even higher upward, but you can see we had a decline, 2003 as a sharp fall, kind of matching the decline in actual crime rates, which is on the other side. But then it started to pick up back up, right? 2003, it started to rise while crime rates continued to drop. Now, why was that? Well, a lot of it was attention paid to crime by the media, right? The media has always paid attention to crime. But what we see in 2003 moving forward is the emergence of a lot of crime shows, right? So we're talking NCIS, CIS, half of the other ones I don't want to talk about. We see a lot of these crime shows come out. Well, what we know is that when people watch crime shows and when they watch news, they have a skewed view of crime in the United States. They generally think it's much higher than it actually is, right? So again, this often occurs in older populations, right? So grandma's watching the news and freaks the hell out. And you're like, no, grandma, it's fine. But they get scared. Like, anybody would be scared watching the news now. It's terrifying. So you're gonna say, yeah, I think crime's going up. And that's kind of how the public perception is. In reality, crime has dropped precipitously, and this is violent crimes per 1,000 persons of ages 12 and older. So you can see violent crime has dropped precipitously, and it continues to drop. We're in one of the lowest crime rates in American history. It just keeps dropping, right? So it's not even necessarily a partisan thing, right? It dropped under President Obama, it dropped under President Trump. It's a continuation of dropping. But our views are going through the roof, right? And that does invoke some partisanship, but also invokes a lot of attention on what we consume as consumers of media, and included with that are crime shows, TV, how do we consume those? So that's why we need smart statistics. We need people who understand statistics enough to address crime problems, right? So I'm going to introduce you to, I'll let her introduce herself in a second. We'll watch this video. It's a TED Talk. It's fairly short, about the use of smart statistics and why we need them. And don't worry, she doesn't go off and like start talking about formulas or anything like that. She was actually a prosecutor in Camden, New Jersey, right? Like one of the deadliest places on earth. So she has a very interesting view that I think lends credence to this notion that if we're going to be effective citizens, effective voters, and we're going to be informed, we have to understand what we're looking at. We can't be just pigeonholed or focused in such a way that we believe crime is one way, not the other. Oh, good. So our browser doesn't play this anymore. Okay. Well, I'll give you an overview of what she says. So she's a big prosecutor, Camden, New Jersey, and what she did is, in Camden, it was, and it's still not great, but it was basically a free-for-all, right? It was like the purge. But lots of people were getting killed, drug trade was out of control, all kinds of other issues emerged. So what she did is she had basically all the police departments that reported to her come with their files, and the chiefs of the police departments sat down and went through every single file to note where something happened, what the crime was, and what the response was. And what she found is overwhelmingly, the police were responding to nonviolent drug and property crimes, right? So the police were making arrests for vandalism, or the police were making arrests for drug crimes, not necessarily violent crime. So that shifted the attention of the police, right? Of, okay, you're doing a lot of work on stuff that is, yeah, it can be a big deal to someone, but for the most part, it's not a big deal, right? Instead of focusing on the violence and looking at different areas where the violence occurs, right? And where that, if there's certain streets, certain neighborhoods where it occurs, maybe we should start flooding the police in those neighborhoods. This is kind of a broken windows theory. Flood the police in those neighborhoods, and hopefully they won't just be displaced, but the crime rates will go down because there'll be less chances for murders, et cetera, et cetera. And in her tenure as a prosecutor, crime went down by 2/3 in Camden, New Jersey, because they used data. Right? They looked and said, okay, where's the crime occurring? What is the actual crime? Why are we making arrests? Right? If somebody's smoking a joint, do we really need to get a police car, do an arrest, do a formal report? Or we just let them go? Like, have them like throw it out and let them go. All right, so again, changes our perception, changes our notion of what crime is. And we have to think about crime that way. Right? When we think crime, we always think murder, robbery, or think felonies. Right? Most crimes are misdemeanors. Most crimes are just low level, like vandalism, possession of drugs, right? Especially possession of marijuana is obviously a big one we looked at last class. So that gives you kind of an idea of where we're at there. So that being said, how do I underscore this importance of measuring crime? I underscore it by saying, theoretically, accurate crime data is necessary to guide and inform policymaking. Right? So if we're going to make policies, if we're going to pass laws, if we're going to tell people where they can patrol, where they can't patrol, we need good data. The problem is we live in a democracy. I know you're like, what? We live in a democracy. That's the problem. Because we don't necessarily make policy based upon data or democracy. We base our decisions on politics, right? It's a partisan notion. So, for instance, you could theoretically say, right, and this is theoretically true, crime is exploding nationwide. That's in complete odds to what I just told you. But I'm misleading you because possession of marijuana has exploded nationwide, and that's it. Right? Again, stuff that we might not even consider a crime. But we say stuff, and politicians say stuff that's not entirely true, doesn't give you the full facts, so that you make your decision based upon what they've said. Right? None of us really do much fact checking. We say, okay, this is what this person says. They're coming from a position of authority. They're in the know. Right? And that's how we kind of cast our ballots. Now, what they can tell us can be technically true, but very misleading. Right? And different administrations have had different responses to crime. Right? So 1960s, we talk about the criminal justice revolution, right? We see the Supreme Court giving us all these brand new rights. And after that, we start to see crime skyrocket. So we do the get tough on crime and the get tough on drugs. The war on drugs, arguably the worst public policy decision in American history. That's where we're at, right? That started to decline when crime started to go down. We kind of leveled off. The 9/11 happened, and suddenly we weren't so much worried about crime in our own neighborhoods. We were worried about terrorism, right? And that actually prevailed quite a bit. Like it still prevails to this day, right? National security. We don't really care about what happens on the streets. We care about national security. So again, different policies or different administrations in different times have different things that they emphasize. Now, scientific measures of crime can do a variety of things, right? They can identify patterns of crime. They can guide the allocation of law enforcement efforts. They can lead to like increased policing in high crime neighborhoods, right? Like we saw in Camden, New Jersey, and under hotspot theory, or even maybe a potential broken windows theory. It shapes views of government and community. Right? So again, generally speaking, unfortunately, the general electorate, us, we're generally uninformed about crime. Right? Like, and I thought about this morning, right? When we got all the messages at 5 o'clock in the morning that we were on lockdown because there was like a shooting or something like that happened off campus, and they fled this direction. And I was like, oh, my first reaction was I screenshotted it, made it into a meme, and sent it to a friend that said, and this is why we can't have nice things. Like, that was my first reaction was, of course, it's Elmira. Of course there's crime. Not, okay, that's actually fairly odd, right? And, well, it's Elmira, but like, it is fairly odd, right? Very uncommon. So that's why we do an emergency response. But we base a lot of our decisions when we vote on our personal experience. Right, so let's say somebody broke into your house. You're going to think crime is out of control versus you live in the very affluent suburbs of Chicago, like the very affluent parts, where you're going to think crime is minimal. And so again, we're uninformed about crime policy. Now, smart statistics, smart data can also help us formulate responses to increase safety. All right, so when we think about recidivism, which is somebody getting out of prison and committing another crime, we can take two approaches. Well, there's more to, but generally we take two approaches: incarceration and rehabilitation. Right, if we want to lower the rate that somebody offends in the future, we either throw them in jail, or we figure out why what happened and fix it. But it's all how we frame the issue. Now, statistically, us just warehousing people in prison doesn't do any good. In fact, it's actually usually leads to an increase in crime when they leave. We have the highest recidivism rate in the world. Other countries and even different states have adopted a rehabilitation model. crime plummets, right? But think about this. One sounds like I'm tough on crime, and the other sounds, oh, I'm easy on crime, right? It's a great soundbite. I'm tough on crime, I put them in jail. Okay, but is that really what we want as a society? If they come back out and they commit more crimes and they're more violent. While you can paste the other person who says, they're like, no, we shouldn't have prisons, right? We should address the issue. We should treat it as drugs as a public health issue. Well, they're going to get slammed for being soft on crime, even though their end goal is what we all want: no more crime, right? So again, it's all a matter of issue framing and being a responsible consumer of the information that you get. So that's why you need to do your research, right? Look at smart statistics. So when we talk about measuring crime in the United States, there's generally 3 sources of crime measurements. And so the official data from criminal justice agencies is recorded in the Uniform Crime Reports. Right? And we'll look at this in a minute, but these are our official measures. Right? Then we have victimization data. So we look at another national poll, basically, of crime victims, and we record that data. And then, of course, we have self-report data. And I'll talk about each of these in a minute. Self-report data is usually done by universities, right? They get a criminal justice grant and they interview potential offenders or people on the streets, whatever. So they kind of come from different places. Now we're going to talk about the Uniform Crime Report. The Uniform Crime Report, compiled by the FBI. We have Category 1 offenses and Category 2 offenses. We'll talk about those in a second. Basically, the idea behind it is all the police departments in the country, theoretically, they don't, but theoretically should, every time something happens that we try to measure at the national level, they should report it to the FBI, right? Like the statistics of the FBI. And so from that, again, a lot of jurisdictions don't, like, especially the small jurisdictions, right, where there's like one cop. No. Like, unless you have like a dedicated analysis unit, like talking New York City Police Department, they have a dedicated analysis unit. Right? You have BPD, Boston Police Department, Chicago Police Department, you name it. But small departments just can't afford it. But we get, theoretically, a kind of a national-wide picture in the Uniform Crime Reports of what crime looks like, at least in the categories that we're measuring. Then we have victimization data surveys. So we also have the National Crime Victimization Survey. And what this does is this polls people and basically asks, in the past year, have you been the victim of a crime? Right, so it's how it works, or how it used to work, I should say, is people would be selected, like we'd select random phone numbers from a phone book, like in every jurisdiction. Right, and then researchers would call, say, have you been the victim of the victimization survey, a victim? The problem is we have to look in a phone book. That means the only people we're calling are people with landlines. So people with cell phones get missed out. So it's good in one sense because we see like what we call the dark figure of crime. This is what we're trying to measure. So the dark figure of crime refers to crimes that have been committed but not referred to the police. Right, so this is, we'll say this way. On college campuses, and this is true actually nationwide, the most underreported crime is sexual assault, right? So we know sexual assaults occur. For the Uniform Crime Report, we get like the official data of police have responded to this. But the victimization survey is trying to get the majority of women, and it's a majority who don't report this, the majority of women, they're trying to get their information, right? Of like, so you didn't call the police, that's fine, we don't care. But were you the victim of a crime? Yeah. What crime? I was sexually assaulted. All right, again, that's with a landline. We don't do it with cell phones. So there's problems with it. But we're theoretically all trying to get to this dark figure of crime. It's good to know what crime is. Crime rates are. The crime rates are misleading. All right, so we all say that crime is going down, and I have no reason to doubt it. But maybe crime isn't being reported as much, and it's actually going up. We're just not reporting it. There is that potential, and that's why we need to measure and have smart data, right? And always question our sources, and question what kind of methods did they use to gather this data. All right, and then we have probably the most unreliable form. Actually, some say it's most unreliable, some say it's the most reliable. Self-report data. This is going up to people saying, in the past year, have you committed a crime? Right? Basically, what we do is we give assurances that it's completely anonymous, right? This doesn't get reported to the police department or anything along those lines. We're just researchers, we're working for a college, and we're just trying to interview people to see if they've committed a crime. And the idea is kind of like, if we get the victimization survey and we add to it like self-report data, maybe they'll give us a better picture of the dark figure of crime. Right? Because we know in any given year, X number of crimes are committed. Right? Nationwide, X number of crimes are committed in any given year. It's an exact number. Right? Starting on 12/00/001 on July 1st, ending at 11/59, 59, 59, 59 on December 31st. X number of crimes are committed. Right? If we know that, that's great. We know everything. We can respond to it. But what we get is X number of crimes are committed, but we only get the top portion of the X. So it looks like to us that V number of crimes are committed. As we cut an X and a half, it's a V, right? But there's that whole V below it that we're ignoring. The V below it, that's the crimes that aren't reported. All right, so we can't get an accurate picture of X without knowing the unreported crimes as well. So, Uniform Crime Report, the UCR. This is a clickable link. If you want to go into the PowerPoint and click on it, you can. It's collected by the FBI, right? So, crime report is in two categories. We have crimes that are reported or known to the police, and arrests. All right, so we already start to break down the data. Right, because police do not make an arrest every time there's a crime. So if we just reported how many arrests we made, that leaves out a whole lot of crimes that we decided it wasn't worth our time, it wasn't worth taxpayer money, nobody was in danger. We're going to say, don't do it again and let them go. All right, so we try to be smart about it and we say, okay, we'll look at arrests, knowing that arrests are problematic because remember our funnel, only a few ever go to prison, right? Like what, 14, 15, or if we have 100 arrests, 15 are guilty or not guilty. So arrests don't really tell us anything. So they're telling us, yeah, we arrested maybe an innocent person. And then crimes known to police, that's better, right? We know of the crime. We didn't make an arrest, but we know of the crime. But it allows us to track and say, okay, what crimes are we making arrests for? What crimes are we not making arrests for? Has this changed? And again, known or reported to police, that's just trying to get that dark figure of crime, right? Of like, oh, somebody broke into my house, right? Or like when I was living in Massachusetts, when I first moved up there, from Missouri. Missouri is a big state, right? Massachusetts is a little tiny state. So like housing outside of Boston is insanely expensive. So I found this really nice like loft apartment complex in New Bedford, Massachusetts, which is basically at the bottom end of the state. And I had to commute to the middle of the state because I suck at geography. And I was like, yeah, I can do that. New Bedford is like Elmira if there were no police officers. And I say that in the sense that my car was broken into 4 times in the 10 months I lived there, right? And this was in like secured parking too, like wasn't just like out in the street. First time, I'm like, oh, I need to call the police, get a police report, right, for my insurance company. I call the police come 6 hours later. I come down, they say, oh, what happened? Oh, they took this, this, and this. All right, well, I'll put it on file. Yeah, we're not gonna even bother really looking into it. And then left. And I was like, okay. So the rest of the other 3 times, I didn't report it. Because like they didn't care. Somebody broke into your car, who cares? So I was like, if they don't care, like why do I report it? So theoretically, I have 3 dark figures of crime. Right? One's known to police, the other 3 aren't. And again, it was just based upon police response. And it makes sense, right? There's allocation of resources. Would we rather spend $100 on somebody looking into somebody's missing first aid kit from their car, or would we rather spend $100 investigating a murder that occurred? Right? It makes sense. I mean, there's really not too much debate about where we should allocate the money. So from that standpoint, we understand that dark crime is not just underreporting because of maybe embarrassment or sexual assault, obviously a very serious issue, but it also could just be out of frustration or just even the lack of, knowing there's a lack of resources and not wanting to bother officers. All right, so that's where we get this crimes versus arrests. Now there's part 1 offenses, category 1 and part 1, and there's part 2 offenses. All right, so what we're gonna focus on is the part 1 offenses. Okay? So this is where we record the arrests and the number known to police. And so we break it down into from the most serious down to like the least serious, but they're still all serious. Right? Generally speaking, these are all felonies. Right? And they go from the most serious to the least. Now we'll talk about an interesting case in a second, but we have, for instance, our part 1 offenses. Also known as index crimes. So part 1 offenses, index crimes, synonymous, right? So if we look at our index crimes, we have homicide, rape, robbery, burglary, aggravated assault, larceny, which is over $50, motor vehicle theft, and arson. That's all the FBI cares about for part 1. Part 2, you can look in Canvas. Part 2 is a very long list. So our index offenses, those are the ones we really get scared about, right? Now, this used to be what the reporting was. It may have changed since then. I think it's undergoing a change now. But let's say that you discovered a rape that resulted in a homicide. Okay. How do you count that? And maybe part of the homicide, they stole the guy's Rolex. Raped him, killed him, stole his Rolex. Right? So we have homicide, rape, larceny over $50. How do we categorize that? Well, historically, we reported the most serious crime. And that was it. All right, so historically, we reported homicide. But in reality, there was a homicide, a rape, and larceny. Now, again, this is before we have all this nice data that kind of lets us do it automatically. Right, this is when police departments had to, by hand, write down, like, tally basically how many offenses were occurred. But what's the problem if we now report there was a homicide, a rape, and a larceny? It looks like there's 3 separate occurrences, right? There's 3 separate offenses, not one singular offense. Right, so even how we record it is difficult, right? It has to challenge us and say, okay, but, right? And that's what you're gonna see throughout this course. Your response will be, okay, but, and in statistics, that needs to be your response as well, right? Okay, but what if we look at it this way, right? Now, yeah, I understand reporting the most serious, but If we triple report, does not mean our crime rate goes up even further when it's one transaction, right? So that's kind of the thing that we have to work on. And then again, part 2 offenses, they're listed on Canvas. Part 1 offenses are, again, the most severe, the ones that we kind of care about the most. And what we do, or what the FBI does, to help us conceptualize crime, is they have created, it's called the crime clock. All right, the crime clock. So, here's the crime clock. What they do is we look at statistics, right? And we say, okay, if we had to break this down, we know that there's, what was it? 500,000 some odd minutes a year, right? 500,000, 565,000, I don't know, whatever the rent song is. Anyway, we conceptualize things by time, right? And this actually kind of comes from the notion that we can picture things in our head and understand and grasp things up to a certain number. All right, so like generally speaking, if something is within 100, we can get it. Or you can conceptualize 100, you can understand 100. If I said 9 trillion, you know it's bigger, but you can't conceptualize exactly how big or what it looks like in comparison, like what are the masses. All right, so what the FBI did is we created the crime clock. We said, okay, we're gonna take the crimes that get reported, and we're gonna divide them by the minutes in a year, right? And the idea is it would give us how many of those crimes were committed every second or every minute of the year. So this is from 2017. If we had said, okay, violent crime, right, from our part 1 offenses, violent crime occurs once every 24.6 seconds in the United States. A murder occurs every 30.5 minutes in the United States. A rape occurs every 3.9 minutes in the United States. There's one robbery every 1.7 minutes. And there's an aggravated assault every 39.0 minutes. Now you look at that and you go, that's scary. That seems scary. Because now we're like, wait, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, rape, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can't start going down that line. Like, you can conceptualize it, right? When we get to the part 2 offenses, which are basically the non-violent lesser felonies and misdemeanors, we're talking property crime. Property crime. We look at burglary, or we look at property crime in general. Property crime occurs every 4.1 seconds in the United States. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, so on, right? Theoretically, 3 crimes just happened. Now, is this like how it actually plays out? No. Criminals don't call each other and go, hey, it's been 4.1 seconds, go for it. It's just how we conceptualize it. All right, so we have a burglary every 22.6 seconds, larceny theft over every 5.1 seconds. And this one always shocks me. I don't know why it shocks me, but it does. A motor vehicle theft every 40.9 seconds. Like, basically every car has GPS in it now. Is what it is. Like, it's the first thing they remove. Like, they kill it before they get to the chop shop. But yeah, so that's where we're at. Right? That's how we conceptualize it. That's how the FBI reports crime data, is via the crime clock. Now, how do we calculate the actual crime rate? Right? Crime clock and crime rate are different. Crime clock just helps us conceptualize how often a crime occurs. Crime rate tells us how often a crime occurs in relation to the population. Right? So here's the formula for figuring out how the crime rate works. Right? So generally speaking, we report crime in we divide it by the hundreds of thousands in terms of population. Right? So we'll say let's say we have like 2 murders, right? And conveniently, we have a population of 200,000 people. We're going to say that there's 1 murder for every 100,000 people, right? That's what we get. We have total crimes divided by population times 100,000 gives us the crime rate. Now, total crime is the sum of all violent and property offenses reported or observed, also known as reports to the police, during a given period and place. So an example that we'll look at is from 2016 United States. So violent crime is defined as the sum of all violent offenses, homicide, forcible rape, robbery, aggravated assault known to the police. Again, we don't have the dark figure of crime here, right? We don't know it. Property crime is the sum of all property offenses, burglary, larceny, motor vehicle theft, and arson known to the police. Again, these are part 1 or index offenses. And we do it per 100,000 inhabitants. The crime rate, or the number of violent and property offenses known to police that occurred in a given area for every 100,000 people living in that area. Why did we choose 100,000? I honestly have no idea. It probably to give us an easier way to conceptualize it. Right, so we did it by million, there's 300 million. Like the crime rates would look ridiculous. Right? We did it by every 10 people, the crime rates would be insane. So we kind of like found this middle ground of like, this is not misleading data, it's fairly straightforward. At least that's what we try for. But at the end of the day, it's still misleading because we don't know about the dark figure of crime, right? Things that don't get reported to the police. So here's how crime has evolved from 1987 to 2010. Right, so we had the total US population, massive increase. Total crime, massive decrease. Violent crime, decrease. Property crime, fairly significant decrease. Right, and so what this chart shows us is, here's our population. Population, all crimes reported to the police, all violent crimes reported to the police, all property crimes reported to the police, per 1,000 inhabitants. So that tells us that total crime in the United States, in 1987, there were 5,575.5 crimes that occurred for every 100,000 people living in the United States. If we jump that down to 2010, when our population has gone up, theoretically our crime rate should go up, right? Should kind of follow a trend. But it doesn't. Right? Total crime decreases by 3 million. Right? So we're down to 10,329,135 crimes. The rate per inhabitants, 3,345.5. Right? So this is the crime rate for total crime. We've moved down the chart. You see 612.5 violent offenses for every 100,000 people, or 403 violent offenses in 2010 for every 100,000 people. And then we see what the big problem is, right? We see where most offenses occur, property crime, right? So if we look at property crime, we say, okay, in 1987, of that 5,575.5 offenses total per 100,000 inhabitants, almost 5,000 of that was for property offenses, non-violent crimes. But yet we're scared of violence. Right? We get freaked out. And this is kind of like we're at the peak of the Get Tough movement and all that jazz. Then 2010, we've kind of scaled it back. We don't use the Get Tough rhetoric as much. Doesn't mean necessarily our policing has changed or our policies have changed. But what we see is there's a massive decrease. Right? Again, if we go for violent crime, 403.6 per 100,000. Property crime, 2,941.9 per 100,000. And you can see, like, this can be misleading, right? You're like, oh, it's still in the millions, still seems high. If we divide it out, it doesn't seem that high. All right, because you think 100,000 people, that's a lot of people. And that's the total crimes. And most of them are non-violent. Right? The vast majority of crime is non-violent. So we'll talk about official data. This is some stuff we kind of discussed a minute ago. The reliability of official data varies, we'll say it that way, based on the underlying offense. So virtually every homicide that's known to police is reported to the FBI. All right, it's the most serious offense, theoretically, and it's the thing that gets reported. Other estimates are deficient, right? And so we talked about the idea of concealment, right? The crime was committed to you, like against you, you didn't report it, you concealed it. So it doesn't take that into account, right? Or the non-reporting of crime. So concealment can be, you were sexually assaulted, a police officer asks, were you sexually assaulted? And you say no, that's concealing it, right? You're hiding it. Or if you get sexually assaulted but you don't report it, that's a non-report. That doesn't get captured in our time clock or in our rate of 100,000 inhabitants, right? This is the dark figure of crime. And as I said before, it's very problematic when it comes to rapes and sexual assaults, because rape and sexual assault is the most underreported crime, at least violent crime in the United States, right? Again, this is known to police, right? So, there's a lot of, it's absolutely horrible, but there's stigma attached to sexual assault, having to relive it, having to go to court. And if you were like me, I was a defense attorney. Before they passed like the rape shield laws, I would put you on the stand as a sexual assault victim and then question you about every single sexual partner you've had, what kinks you have. Do you like bondage? Do you like this? Do you like that? And my job would try to make you, it's normally females, not to say males can't be sexually assaulted or raped, they absolutely can. But mainly female, my job as a defense attorney would have been to make you look like a whore, right? Because we have a dumb jury. We'll talk about juries. Juries are like cattle, right? They are dumb. And if I get up there and I'm like, you saying this person raped me, and then I go like, well, your last boyfriend and you, didn't you guys use some tie-ups, use some handcuffs? Don't you have a rape fantasy? Really? Because your ex-boyfriend told me you had a rape fantasy. How about you tell the court about your rape fantasy? What's that jury hearing? Or he's making it up. All right? So what happened is we passed the rape shield law, and what it does is it prevents me from asking certain questions of sexual assault victims, or survivors, I should say. Unless I have a really good reason to, that the court approves. All right? So, if you're in that situation, know that you get on the stand, defense attorney really can't do much, right? And the hardest part is going to be on the prosecution side, where you just tell your story. It's going to be emotional. It's going to be difficult. But if you're in that situation, whether you're male, whether you're female, please report. All right? We have support services now that are tremendous. We'll relocate you from housing to another house if you want. I mean, we have all kinds of things that we can provide survivors of sexual assault, right? Because there's not a whole lot that we can provide a homicide victim because they're dead. Sexual assault victim, alive. So we can provide services, and we do. So again, this is slowly starting to change. It really started picking up. It picked up and then kind of died down. There was that Believe Her movement. That was like hashtag Believer. Basically saying like, don't just dismiss somebody, or usually a woman, who says they were sexually assaulted, right? Males tend to dismiss it. Like, it's like Believer. This is what happened. So we saw actually a pickup in the number of reports since then, but we know it's crazy underreported. Like I've said before in different classes, 1/3 of women who go to college will be sexually assaulted while they're in college. That's the number we know of. That doesn't include the dark figure of crime, crimes that we don't know of. Yeah, and so when we're talking about the official data, going back to it, rates and proportions, they're more relatable and understandable, easy for us to understand than just a sheer number. But if I told you there were 1 million murders last year, holy crap. If I said, well, there was 1 in every 300 people were murdered. Okay, that sounds a little bit better, but you get the point. Now, we do have a different system. It's a different official data system. It's the National Incident-Based Reporting System. And again, if you want to look at it, you just click this link, it'll take you right to it. And what it does is it has Group A offenses, there's 24 of them, and Group B offenses. It's kind of like we have index crimes, or Part 1 crimes, Part 2 crimes. Okay? So for Group A offenses, specific facts have to be gathered by the police and reported. For Group B offenses, just arrest information is enough. So what is this doing? This is doing in the National Incident-Based Reporting System. Now, not only am I telling you there's a homicide, I'm telling you that homicide occurred with a rape, which occurred with a larceny, it occurred at night. There's certain information I now provide the Department of Justice, the FBI, under the Incident-Based Reporting System, so it gives us a more cohesive picture. A more cohesive picture. Then if we move into surveys, in terms of victim surveys, the first one actually began in 1965. Right? We've been doing victimization surveys since then. Again, the landline issue was a big problem. It still is to this day. And what we see, and what's scary, is when we look at National Crime Victimization Survey, or at least look at the initial victimization surveys, what we see are 2 drastically different numbers. Right, so we have what the UCR reports, the official crime report is, right? Our proportion, the number of offenses that are official, vastly lower than the number of offenses that people report in the National Crime Victimization Survey. Vastly different. All right, so yeah, several times higher than the UCR when we started out. Now, National Crime Victimization Survey is continued. Again, you can click that link and get to it. Basically found many crimes aren't reported to the police. Most crimes are not reported to the police. Right? Kind of one of our first big things. Rape is underreported. Homicides is virtually always reported. DCR, the National Crime Victimization Survey, they're not fully comparable, right? Because NCVS, it's selecting people, right? It's like, you, about you, random selection. Idea is to get a cross-section of the community, and then from there, be able to come up with a realistic number. UCR is, no, this is what happened, right? We know this is what happened. So they're not, again, necessarily on the same plane. So when we think of like the chief contribution of the National Crime Victimization Survey, is focusing on a victim as a source of information on a crime. Right, because it's one thing to say, hello, my name is so-and-so. I'm calling on behalf of the National Crime Victimization Survey. It's put out by the Department of Justice every year. Please don't share everything your name. I'm calling to see if you or anyone in your household has been the victim of crime in the past 12 months. If yes, what crime? All answers remain anonymous. Being reported to police or anything along those lines. Please tell me, did anything occur? You might feel a lot more comfortable opening up over the phone where you're safe in your home, especially like sexual assault, than you maybe would in front of like police officers, right? We're trying to deal with this. So we can't overlook the victim. Right? The victim kind of gives us a real good source of the dark figure, but again, it's still not on the same plane or compatible or comparable with the UCR. Then we have self-reported criminal behavior. It's another way that we try to measure the dark figure of crime, right? So these stars are official, reported, known crimes. Everything else, we're trying to measure the dark figure. What it suggests, what we've found, is criminal activity is much more widespread than police files suggest. Right, so we engage in more criminal activity than is officially reported, which kind of goes hand in hand with the National Crime Victimization Survey, right? Like, a lot of crimes just don't get reported. Like, did you commit a crime? Yep. And it can be small, but it's like, yes, pickpocketing somebody. Okay, maybe that doesn't get reported to the police. It is what it is. But it tells us that it self-reports. This is when the offender reports, right, that they did it. It obviously has limitations. Limitations being it's usually done by universities or colleges, so it gets federal funding. Usually it's like students doing it on behalf of the professor, and the professor writes it up and puts it in like a big journal, and it is what it is. So there's limitations. But the key limitations to keep in mind are validity and reliability. Our validity tells us what? And the name. How valid our responses are. Right? Like, are they being truthful? Right? Like, if somebody called me up and was like, have you ever committed a murder? I'd be like, hell yeah, I did. And that doesn't sound badass. Not necessarily valid. Right? Reliability comes into play too. Can you replicate this? Right? If we say 1 year we call 100 offender or 100 potential offenders, and we ask them questions, and they say they reported 20 crimes, and the next year we asked another 100 people, and they reported 80 crimes. Is this a reliable measure? Probably not. Right, so validity and reliability, you'll get into those a lot in statistics. They come into play here. There's sample biases. So how do we choose who reports? Generally speaking, the offender or would-be offender reports. All people have different incentives, right? It's just like if you ever listen to the radio and they do like a call-in show, or they do a call-in segment, or like call in and express your support or your non-support for this issue. And here's the issue. Tell us about it. Statistically, the vast majority of people who call in are going to be people who have a negative view or a bad view of the subject being talked about. They have motivation to, right? They're like, huh. Very few people in support of it ever come out, ever call in, right? And it's just the same thing with victimizations or offender surveys, right? It's, yeah, they might be telling the truth, they might not, who knows? And again, that's one thing that's true across victimization surveys and offender surveys. Is the truth being told? Are we measuring it in a reliable way? Do we have a sample bias? In this case, it's a self-selected sample, so we can't measure it. Right, so this call-in shows like, oh yeah, we've had today 10 people calling against it and 1 person for it, so I guess it must be unpopular. You're like, no, they chose to call in. Like, we know that generally speaking, if you take the negative view, you call in. Right, so again, we have to be very good consumers of our data. There's other methodological limitations. Again, you'll get into that in statistics and kind of research design, etc. So there's just a couple other sources for you to look at. Again, I encourage you to click on these links when you get back to your dorms or wherever. Look at them. These will be helpful going forward. So if you do decide to be a criminal justice major or legal studies major, which you should, because I teach basically all legal studies classes and I'm awesome, and I want to stay employed, take a look at these, right? They give you great ideas. They're mainly from, well, the source book of criminal justice statistics. It's data from a variety of state and federal agencies. If you want to think about illegal drugs, you want to do some research on illegal drugs. National Survey on Drug Use and Health. It's great. Reporting instrument. Monitoring the future looks at drug use among high school students. It's going up. Shocking, right? I mean, it's just pot, but like, still. And then this is a fun one to play around with. It's like, it seems scary at first. It's a little overwhelming in terms of information. But the Bureau of Justice Statistics, this is where we compile everything, every study about crime, whatever. You can like say, you can get really specific, like how many arsons were committed by Black females who identified as Christian, but you can just go to town and like a number will pop out. It's amazing. So again, take a look at it, get curious. They're great resources, especially moving forward. So that being said, I ask that you also take a look at this video. You should be able to access it via Canvas. It won't access here because the computer here is what it is. But this woman discusses the dark figure of crime in terms of human trafficking. All right, so term 3, I'm teaching my International Human Rights Law class, which is basically focused on human trafficking. Right, we look at prostitution, we look at forced labor, but our focus is mainly sex trafficking. And this is a very well-known scholar discussing that when it comes to sex trafficking, we have absolutely no idea how many people are trafficked a year, where they get trafficked. We can identify certain patterns, but we are just in the dark. And that's terrifying. Right? That's absolutely terrifying. So if you don't get scared, watch the video. I also give you motivation to take my term 3 class, and we'll talk about prostitution, the pros, the cons, all that stuff. We'll get into it, but this just kind of puts a face on why do statistics matter? And I hate math. I hate it, hate it, hate it. But why do statistics matter? This. Drug and human trafficking, right? Especially human trafficking. How many people are kidnapped, smuggled, sold, or forced to be addicted to drugs, then sold to pimps, where they have to have sex against their will for money that give back to their pimp for the rest of their life, or until they basically die. It's a very sad story she presents, very sad statistics. But it's definitely worth taking a look at it to understand, like, why does this actually matter? Like, who gives a shit about the crime rate? This is why we care, right? We care about the crime rate because we want to lower it, obviously. But we also care because we want to know what we don't know, right? We want to help the people we don't know about. And that's where statistics come into play. Statistics basically say you have people that you know about, cases that you know about, things you've taken care of. On the other end, there's a whole group of people that you haven't taken care of. A whole bunch of crimes, horrible crimes that have been committed against them. Some maybe they got their car broken into, or some they've been sold into human trafficking. You're not taking care of them, right? We can allocate our resources this way, but what about them? Why are we allocating resources to them? We can't identify them, right? That's where statistics comes into play. It helps to identify what we don't know, so we can start to trap, or so we can start to fight crime, right? And it tells us what we do know. Right? We do know that you do not go to the 7-Eleven unless you're drunk past 6 p.m. or 11 p.m. because you'll get stabbed. I'm not kidding. There's been a stabbing every single year I've been here at the 7-Eleven. Like, this is my 5th year? 6th? I don't know, 5th year? There's been a stabbing every single year at 7-Eleven. So, like, don't go to it, like, after 11 p.m. But it helps us know that, okay, this is maybe an area of concern. Statistics tells us this. But there's other areas, right? We're going to look at those. So that being said, next class, we're going to jump into criminology, explaining criminal behavior. So this is a little bit of Criminal Minds, but like the actual how it works. I'll give you a fair warning. The FBI does not have a private plane chartered for behavioral sciences, behavioral analysis unit. It's a bunch of old guys who went to Harvard in the 1970s who sit around the table. That's basically it.